in exhibition. The topic of the Greek participation into the 10th International Exhibition of Architecture Venice Biennale in 2006 was the dispersed urbanity of the Aegean archipelago. According to the curators, the topic is based on the heretical conviction of historian Ruggiero Roman that the Aegean archipelago is a city, a view also held in differing versions by other historians, and which, from a geophilosophical aspect, is advocated by the philosopher Massimo Cacciari. Cacciari argues that it's the state of separation, its isolation, isola, that defines the existence of an island. As a result of severance as a fractional part, the island in itself implies the entirety of its origin and shapes a context for continual comparison with and measurement against that entirety. Similarly, the sea that surrounds the island, the Pontus, as implied by the common etymological origin with the word bridge, pont, is simultaneously the element that reunites it with the mainland. Seaspace. Although a rather neglected topic of study, in recent years anthropologists have reconsidered the meaning of seawater in anthropological studies and focused on the interconnections of water and human interactions. Thus, Stefan Helmreich explains how seawater has operated as a theory machine for generating insights about human cultural organization, drawing on seaside ethnographies, maritime anthropologists, and contemporary social theory, while Christian Hastrup and Frida Hastrup are interested in diverse ethnographies of water worlds in the effort to explore social life as configured by water in one form or another. One of the questions that arise is, how does one define, demarcate, delimit, and distinguishing between bodies of water? Through an interpretation of visual representations of the open sea and the archipelago, and using the Aegean Sea as the example, we will focus in this visual essay on the interconnections, exclusions, and restrictions generated through the representation of bodies of water and dry land as contrasting opposites. Archipelagos. In her article naming the Aegean Sea in 2012, historian Paola Ceccarelli wonders whether the sea has to be always defined in terms of its interaction with the land, whether it is possible to achieve a perspective from the sea's viewpoint and capsize our conventional land-based frame of reference. She notes that maps typically give the impression that the sea is a negative. In her effort to analyze the gradual disappearance of the sea and the privileging of a deeply rooted in Western thought land-based perspective, she turns to one of the seas of the Mediterranean. She writes, and I quote, "Archipelago was the name given to the Aegean space in the Renaissance. One of the many isolari of the Renaissance gives a reason. It is named today archipelagos as if the most important or the prince of seas, for the many islands that it has seem truly to give it this royal position." In this text, the importance of the sea is seen to lie in the many islands it contains. In a further step, however, the term archipelago moved from being a specific name for one of the seas of the Eastern Mediterranean to being the term that defined a group of islands. Through a mechanism similar to photographical inversion, the name that originally indicated the main sea, a main sea being important because it contained islands but still a sea, is now used to indicate a group of islands in the perception of insular space in which the sea appears only in the negative. End of quote. According to Ceccarelli, Aegean as a named space, not as a place and not as a generic sea, makes a relatively late entry in Greek literature, and even then, interestingly and significantly, it took a relatively long time for the name to emerge and impose itself as representing a region, the Aegean, and the sea in that area, and even once the name was established, the limits of the area thus defined remained variable. Dividing the oceans. Martin Lewis, who teaches world history and global geography, argues in his article Dividing the Ocean Sea in 1999 that the Western conceptualization of oceans involves different ways of dividing and labeling the sea that reflect the epistemic environment of their time. In the 20th century, the world is usually imagined from the equatorial vantage point, if not from the northern hemisphere's mid-latitudes, where the oceans appear to form separate basins. This perspective that emphasized the natural separation of the sea into discrete oceans became a dominant one as the globalist vision of scholars like Alexander von Humboldt and Élisée Reclus, who argued in favor of one great ocean, waned. Undividing the sea. Similarly, the current division of the seas reflects geopolitical, historical, and cultural concerns. The Aegean Sea provides a very good example of how the water can be divided across territorial waters, oil concessions, maritime routes, migrants, and refugee sea routes. During its history, the Aegean Sea has been constantly divided and redivided following complex historical moments, geopolitical situations, and technological interests. Drawing on the land and land interests for the justification of these divisions, the Aegean Sea has been perceived as the negative of its land surroundings. Yet, what other stories the Aegean Sea as an archipelago in its original meaning could tell us? Which other thoughts and representations the reverse image of the Aegean Sea could evoke? An image that gives an impression that land is a negative, an image that depicts the Aegean Sea as a peninsula which is not very different from another peninsula, let's say Jutland. Drawing on this assumption, architect-artist Michael Dodson-Sifneus has produced a couple of images that challenge our accustomed approach. Interlude. From another perspective, sailors and seamen have always spoken in favor of the undivided nature of the seawater. Taking seriously this challenge in both its anthropological and artistic consequences allows us to approach the concept of cosmopolitics developed by Isabel Stengers from the perspective of the sea. Cosmopolitics at sea enables us to reconsider the relation between politics and sea, rethink on, with, through, sea, water, ocean, and reflect on them not as neutral, natural entities, but as Helmreich suggests, material entities whose descriptions have been shaped and reshaped by rhetorics that contain, we would add, both utopian and dystopian potentialities.
The distribution of worldwide wind wave heights is transforming. According to a 2019 paper in Science, wind speed increases over the Earth's southernmost oceans, consequent upon surface warming, have led to amplifications there in wave height of some 30 centimeters since 1985 for the largest 10% of waves. And although rising wave heights are also manifesting in the northern hemisphere, particularly toward high latitudes, amplification in southern seas is more intense because the southern hemisphere hosts more uninterrupted ocean surface than the northern, giving waves longer fetches over which to grow in size and strength. This is significant for maritime worlds in the southern hemisphere, with bigger waves arriving at harbors and coastlines, but also elsewhere, as the Southern Ocean is the source for many swell patterns worldwide. The Southern Hemisphere, with more oceanicity than the North, may also make it a harbinger of what is to come, and what is in fact already happening, on an increasingly climate-morphing, sea-surfaced planet. In Theory from the South, Jean and John Komaroff argue that Northern, that is, European and American, social histories, tendencies, and theories may be inadequate to apprehending the motivating forces of the world today, which they see most starkly represented in the countries of the global South. Meg Samuelson and Charn Lavery seek to develop a parallel account for what they call the Oceanic South. They write, quote, "The southern region of the globe is most readily conceived of as what is bound by the longitudinal lines of imperial and metropolitan domination, or described by the curvier Brant line as comprising the poorer nations. But it might also be defined by the relatively vast maritime expanses that distinguish the southern hemisphere." Unquote. The Komaroffs suggest that the global South and its geographies have been treated in social theory as, quote, "a place of parochial wisdom, of antiquarian traditions, of exotic ways and means, and, above all, of unprocessed data, reservoirs of raw fact," unquote, rather than, as they might rather be, prescient pointers to directions world affairs might be taking. Think, then, of the rising wave heights in the oceanic South as phenomena that underscore the changes coming in the global ocean, stronger storms, surges that inundate coastal communities. Waves, of course, are often treated as symbols for fast-arriving, inevitable futures. Think of any number of wave disaster movies. The futures waves bring are not, of course, only environmentally animated ones, but also curled together with the effects of human overreaching, greed, and denial. Today's Anthropocene, Plantationocene, Capitalocene, and Militarocene oceans, overfished, acidifying, warming, irradiated, are nothing if not hybrid nature-culture material semiotic forces that churn political economic processes into the stir, surge, and spray of the sea. I skipped a step. How do oceanographers arrive at knowledge of increasing wave heights? Answer: through environmental observation and computer modeling. Wave heights are measured by buoys and satellites, whose emplaced distributions at sea and in orbit are shaped by political, economic, and military histories, with Europe and the United States dominant players in this domain. Wave measurements are turned into statistics and fed into descriptive and predictive computer models, making known wave height data a layering of the actual and the virtual. Higher wave heights in the southern hemisphere, then, are not so much unprocessed data from the south as data made legible through theory from the north. Such data emerges from computer models trained on wind speeds from northern seas, and in fact, often from the North Sea. If theory, in its etymology, points us to the ancient Greek for to see, wave spectra are often seen through theory from the north. In fact, back in the year 2000, one European ocean model had been found to underestimate wave heights by 20% in the southern hemisphere. In 2014, Nature Climate Change published on misestimations of southern sea surface temperatures in most climate models, assuming too low cloud cover over southern oceans. Wave modelers in recent years have become increasingly aware of these matters, and a thoroughgoing epistemological critique of wave theory from the north would dig into the histories of the kinds of waves that were early on relevant to colonial desires for speed in seafaring. Think then of increasing wave heights in the south as following from ongoing militarism, extractivism, pollution, their sizes signatures of rising carbon dioxide levels. Computer scientist Francisco Alarcón is working to illustrate such redistribution in a piece of provocative art, and you've been watching some of his experiments for that piece here. He envisions a machine learning AI program that generates digital images of waves, images whose realist verisimilitude is improved as the program is trained on photographs of waves. As the AI network learns, it will, like many such pattern recognition algorithms, use more and more electricity. Employing the magnitude of that energy usage, the carbon footprint of the calculation, as an input to grow the height of the virtual waves, the work would become an allegorical enactment of the electro-anthropogenic driving of climate-changed wave power, and an aesthetic double for scientific assessments, which also depend on the consumption of computing power. Consumption that, as I revise this presentation, is right now intensifying as digital telecommunication and video conferencing surges alongside the uneven and global growth of the coronavirus pandemic. In 1957, oceanographers Roger Revelle and Hans Suess wrote in a watershed paper on rising atmospheric CO2, quote, "Within a few centuries, we are returning to the atmosphere and oceans the concentrated organic carbon stored in sedimentary rocks over hundreds of millions of years," unquote. The we and the mode of returning here need constantly to be specified. North-south inequalities are grids within which to do that accounting. Such a returning to the atmosphere and oceans of carbon must also be understood as itself now returning in the waves, which carry messages of growing north-south imbalance, of political ecological inequalities, marked by differences of latitude and amplitude.
Some people may find images in this video distressing. People have always lived around and crossed the sea, even though just about everything has changed in how and why they do that. And wherever people go, including across the sea, there are animals who accompany them, whether the people intend for those animals to be there or not. This is a brief story about those relations between the people, the animals, and sea transport, and the dramatic way those relations have changed over the years. My focus is on the Mediterranean, so images of the sea in this video are mostly from there, and this particular one is from Beirut. But of course, the whole world is involved in this sea transport in one way or another. People have been transporting animals across the sea for centuries. Horses, camels, and other pack animals, chickens, sheep, goats, cows, pigs, carrier pigeons, dogs, cats, even beehives, and occasionally a variety of more exotic species. In Roman times, there was quite a trade in exotic animal trafficking. Given the importance of animals for human life for millennia, as well as the fascination that humans seem to always have had about animals, the fact that they have been brought along with people on their sea journeys is not so very surprising. Over the centuries, some of those animals have been accused of terrible crimes. Rats, for example, who regularly hitched a ride on trading ships, are blamed for spreading bubonic plague to most of Europe in the 1660s. It turns out that the rats were partly framed. It was actually the fleas who spread the plague, both to the rats and to the people. The fleas also hitched a ride on the bodies of both of them, passing the plague as they hopped from one tasty body to the next. Rats took the blame for hundreds of years before anybody worked it out. The sea is not that easy a place to be for either people or their livestock. The relationship between them developed on land and became a firm mutual dependence as the decades and centuries passed. This is a camel market outside Cairo. Nowadays, the camels here are going to be sold for meat. In the past, it was a key place to buy an essential work animal for people living in Egypt. Camels are still work animals in some places, but not here anymore. Most rural landscapes in the Mediterranean region, most especially in the hilly and mountainous areas, have been crisscrossed by the routes taken by shepherds with their animals, shifting according to the seasons and according to where the markets were. Those routes followed the needs of the animals, the places where they had to go for water, food, shelter and protection from sheep thieves and other unpleasant kinds of people. Sometimes the routes were designed to avoid tolls and taxes as well. Today, there are still some places where this close and small-scale relationship between people and livestock carries on. It needs both the people and the animals to wander regularly across the landscape. But this kind of movement, where animals travel on their own feet rather than being transported on motorized vehicles, and where they and their shepherds move across the landscapes according to what they need, rather than following the regulations of the political borders, is increasingly rare. Apart from the restrictions of the political boundaries, animal husbandry, and with it animal transport, became much larger scale as the 20th century progressed. With a higher population, with the development of industrialization, with higher levels of urbanization, with increasing levels of wealth, and along with that wealth, increasing demand for the most expensive things that animals can provide for people, most especially meat, things began to change. These images, including the chickens and one duck in amongst the cars, are of the animals belonging to some Bedouin people, both in the West Bank and in the Negev desert region. Over the last couple of decades, the complexities of border restrictions and competition for land has become so intense in this area that it is difficult for the Bedouin to see too much of a future for their way of life. But they insist that they will keep on trying. Even early on in the 20th century, the implications of transporting animals in ever higher numbers and across ever higher distances began to have consequences, as those uninvited little guests that always accompany both people and livestock started taking those longer trips as well. In the early 1920s, there was an outbreak of rinderpest amongst cattle across 3 continents in the world. Eventually, the outbreak was traced to a shipload of cattle from India destined for Brazil, which stopped for a brief period in Antwerp, Belgium. As a result, the World Organization of Animal Health, originally called the OIE, was founded in 1924 to try and find a way to coordinate information and responses to the spread of disease across borders. The founding of the OIE was thus entirely linked to the intensification of animal transport across the oceans. In the last 40 years or so, the demand for the products of livestock has skyrocketed, and with it, the need to transport live animals across the seas. What has particularly driven this need for animal products is the desire for modernity in the form of hamburgers, amongst other things. The ships to carry the livestock have grown. The animals themselves have been bred so that they are bigger, grow faster, or in other ways fit the requirements of an industrialized world. The scenes of overpacked livestock cargo ships, combined with a couple of famous and terrible disasters in which capsized ships led to the deaths of thousands of animals, has led to repeated demands to fix things, to make the animal transport by sea less nightmarish. And progress has been made. Some ships are a lot better now, but they still get bigger. Those ever bigger ships mean that the potential for disease to be spread across wide distances by those little creatures that accompany us on our travels has increased hugely. Researchers have been tracking that for decades, so the new virus, SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19 disease, is not that surprising to them. One lesson is that the relation between animals, people, and transportation has never involved fixed borders. The shepherds of the past might have something to teach us about how to live with that.
Techniques of floating, time and space in the urban sea. I was at sea, literally and metaphorically. In a boat with Mumbai's coastal fishers, I was trying to understand how they apprehend time and space in a sea where everything and nothing is visible. I was very lost and asking the wrong questions. For instance, when I would ask how far fishers would go to fish, they would tell me how deep they would fish, a measure that would change with the tides. To inhabit the sea is to notice measures of time and space that I could not, at least initially, apprehend. Mumbai is a city made through relations with the sea. Today, Mumbai regularly appears on what I'm calling the endangered cities list, a list of cities whose inundation is portended by the rising waters of climate change. Yet this is a terrestrial story, of land being inundated by water. I was navigating the urban sea with Mumbai's indigenous Koli fishers because I want to provincialize this terrestrial story. I want to read practices of urban habitation in the sea. In this paper, I show how fishers read and act in the urban sea through boundary-making practices that bring celestial bodies, tides, and more than human others into relation. I wish to think of sea cosmologies not to highlight how sea thinking is distinct from land. Landscape architects Dilip Dekuna and Anuradha Mathur, as well as anthropologist Stefan Helmrich, have shown that thinking of the sea in this way, or the city as dry, has a colonial lineage, of a free, watery, maritime nature distinct from a dry, urban culture. Instead, I do so to draw attention to the blind spots that emerge, for fishers and urban planners alike, when the sea and the city are treated as distinct nature cultures. In my short presentation today, I examine the possibilities and limits that emerge from fisher practices of reading the sea. While these practices reach their limit, iteratively crossing the coastline I suggest in the larger project makes new processes visible across the urban sea. Philosopher of science Karen Barad has demanded an attention to the boundary-making practices through which measurements and situated experiences of space-time are brought into being. If, following Barad, and I quote, "we don't comment on nature, we are in nature," Koli fishers make agential cuts within phenomena to realize the possibility of finding fish in the sea. Living in both land and sea, Koli fishers live in over 15 fishing villages, or Koliwadas, in the heart of Mumbai. To become fishers and to produce a sea that reveals fish, Kolis have, over the years, sutured heavenly temporalities with more earthly ones so as to produce a fishery in the urban sea. Fishing season extends from late August into early June. It begins on Nariyal Purnima, celebrated on the first full moon of the month of Shravan in the Hindu calendar. This is generally late August. That fishing begins on the first full moon day is not incidental. The tides are strongest on the days of the full and new moon every month, when the most bountiful catches are caught. Accordingly, through the year, fishing labor is focused on the days preceding and following the full and new moon. While the moon advises fishers to narrow fishing times to conducive times of month, The sun advises them of when, on a given day, they may be most likely to catch fish. Fish, my friends tell me, move to and from shallower waters at dawn and dusk. So fishers rise before the sun to catch the fish that rise with it. If nets aren't cast before dawn, or just before dusk, they would complain that they missed the window for a good catch. Taken together, fishing times are ordered by attending to the relations and positions of the sun and the moon and the earth as they orbit and rotate around each other through the days, months, and years. Decisions to fish are also socially embedded. Anxious for a good catch, fishers regularly go out during the first spring tides of every fishing season. But as the season wears on, the decision of whether to go out fishing on the edges of this period is socially decided, based on whether and where others have caught fish the previous day. This, together with the color of the water and the wind speed, inform the decision of when to fish. The practice of casting nets and deciding precisely where to fish is also socially negotiated. The different fishing villages each establish their contiguous fishing areas. Within this area, fishers from the same village actively negotiate distances from other nets that are already in the sea, trying to keep both some distance and yet be close enough to create a cascade of nets across which fish cannot cross. Here too, nets are in dynamic relation, not just with others claiming fisheries, but also the winds and the tides. For instance, fishers attend closely to the currents and the winds to make the work of fishing more expedient. So when they cast nets at sea, they point their boats in the direction of the tide, so that it quickly opens their nets and carries it behind them. And when pulling up their nets, they do so accounting for the direction of the wind, towards ensuring that the nets do not get pushed under the boat while they do so. Taken together, fishers in the urban sea suture various temporalities of celestial bodies, social relations, and urban space to do their work. That is to say, following Barad, fishers do not fish on the sea, but in it. Nevertheless, today coolies complain that their seas of fish are now also made with the waters of anthropogenic pollution and climate change. They struggle to read the sea in a way that accounts for the uncertainties of sewage and industrial runoff, as well as rising sea surface temperatures. They are constantly disappointed by the absence of fish, or surprised by the unusual conditions in which they are found. Writing about the work of firefighters in the American West, Adriana Petrina has suggested an attention to the practice of what she calls, quote, horizoning work, local and highly practical forms of research that attempt to bring an unknown or runaway future into the present as an object of knowledge and intervention, end quote. This work is especially difficult in the sea. As Stefan Helmrich points out, the sea puts human and non-human agencies, forms of life and life forms, into a confusing spin cycle, end quote. Conversely, in recent years, municipal administrators in Mumbai find their ways of reading the city as solid as being insufficient. Today, massive garbage tides return sewage and solid waste to the city. Urban flooding events regularly inundate the city. Municipal administrators, perhaps, would do well to read the city as coolies do, with the sun, the moon, and the wind. Urban seas, after all, are composed as much of practices on land as they are on water.
In 2008, the International Palestine Solidarity Movement took to the sea. The aim was to challenge the embargo imposed by the State of Israel on the Gaza Strip, to raise awareness about the humanitarian crisis engulfing 2 million people, and to deliver much needed aid to the population. In August, the first ships of the campaign reached the port of Gaza. They were also the first international vehicles to arrive from the sea in 42 years. In the coming months, boats carried doctors, journalists, activists, and basic supplies to Gaza from Cyprus. In January 2009, the military operation Cast led destroyed the Solidarities ships docked at the Gaza port. All subsequent maritime efforts were violently intercepted. In 2010, responding to the population's appeals and urgent needs, the International Solidarity Movement formed the Gaza Freedom Flotilla. Initially, the fleet consisted of 8 ships, but due to damages, only 6 sailed on May 30th, carrying 700 passengers on their decks and 10,000 tons of humanitarian aid in the holds. In the early morning of May 31st, the Israeli Navy assaulted all ships in international waters. During the violent takeover, 9 passengers were shot dead, countless were injured, and the rest were kept in the Beersheba prison until they were allowed to return to their home countries. The ships captured the world's attention. Therefore, scholars refer to them as the Soweto of the Palestine Solidarity Movement and the attack that changed the course of the Israel-Palestine conflict. This May marks the 10th anniversary of the sailing of the Gaza Freedom Flotilla. While screening unpublished material from on board one of the ships before and during the assault, I explore how, a decade later, the ships to Gaza might relate to rising risks at sea and their diverse distribution. Expanding territorialities. In September 2007, after Hamas won the Palestinian elections, Israel declared Gaza a hostile entity. Imposing a land, air, sea embargo, it massively reduced the supply of goods and the movement of persons to and from the Strip. Citing security concerns, Israel effectively expanded its borders beyond the territorial waters while transforming the coastal territory into a closed-off enclave, in fact, an isolated island. Expanding territorialities tend to render indigenous population landless, forcing them to move out, while expanding states depict landless humanity as risk to their security. Receiving states treat the landless populations as a risk to their sovereignty. States often transform the land into islands, containing this risky humanity in isolated enclaves and closed-off refugee camps. Mahmoud Darwish, the exiled poet, described the rising landlessness in Palestine with these words: "The earth is closing on us, pushing us through the last passage, and we tear off our limbs to pass through. I wish we were its wheat so we could die and live again. I wish the earth was our mother, so she'd be kind to us. Where should we go after the last frontiers? Where should the birds fly after the last sky?" Darwish talks about the earth and the sky, while conspicuously avoiding any mention to the sea. Perhaps, I think, because the sea is what lies after the last frontiers, because the sea is where the birds fly after the last sky. Turbulent Mineralities. In 1999, Israel discovered natural gas in the Sea of Gaza. In 2011, after years of stalled negotiations with the Palestinian Authority, the Israeli Ministry of National Infrastructure unilaterally began the exploration of the Noah gas field in the sea, 35 kilometers off the embargoed Gaza. In January 2020, Greece, Cyprus, and Israel signed a deal for the construction of EastMed, a gas pipeline that would connect the Israeli gas fields to Europe. The 2,000 kilometers pipeline, estimated to cost over $6 billion, is to be concluded by 2025. However, ecological concerns on the volcanic activity in the seabed could threaten the stability of the pipeline. In addition, geopolitical tensions between the signatories and the excluded states, such as Turkey, Palestine, and Lebanon, could also endanger the regional peace. Expensive infrastructure for deep-sea drilling could finally burden state budgets. Paraphrasing geographers Steinberg and Peters in their call to consider the turbulent materialities of the ocean, I regard the recent gas and oil explorations in the East Mediterranean as exemplary cases of turbulent mineralities. In the hermetically closed-off Mediterranean Sea, the turbulent mineralities of the EastMed pipeline present multiple risks at once. environmental, financial, and geopolitical. In the geopolitically explosive environment of the East Mediterranean, mineral extraction is necessarily joins forces with maritime militarism. Often, the use of unmanned autonomous vehicles and undersea drones is coupled with the proliferation of seabed pipelines and offshore extraction platforms. Inspired by the work of Alan Sekula, the photographer critic who documented how automation tends to eclipse humanity from maritime logistics, I follow how, off the coast of Gaza and in the sea beyond it, turbulent mineralities tend to eliminate humanity by externalizing risk to automation. Maritime solidarities. Expanding territorialities and turbulent mineralities are twin forces that order hegemonic partition of risk at sea. The partition is premised on distributing risk outwards, either to the landless or to the laboring humanities, respectively. In contrast, grassroots movements that take to the sea to practice solidarity with those resisting or suffering from contemporary forms of colonial enclosures, state oppression, and humanitarian neglect disrupt and distort this outward partition of risk. Solidarity at sea distributes risk inwards, towards oneself. The ships to Gaza, but also the fishermen, islanders, and activists practicing solidarity with refugees at sea redistribute risk selfwards. They risk incarceration, violation of their humanity, and even death. As the current pandemic manifests, the politics of risk distribution is a core component of today's highly interconnected and hyper-fragile world. Pursuing and actively participating in a more democratic and equal partition of risk is, it seems, inevitable for a politics of radical equality and planetary coexistence.